I just wanted to quickly mention that by popular demand, the Savage Books channel now officially has a Patreon. Becoming a patron to this channel will help more than you can really imagine, and will allow me to keep pumping out the content you guys like. And by becoming a patron, you can get access to cool perks like your name in my videos, personalized short stories written by me, and even discounts on my editing services. If you want to help out the channel, I will leave a link for the Patreon in the description. Flashbacks. They have been a fixture in storytelling for quite a while. They are used in narratives like the Odyssey and in entries in the Arabian Nights collection. For something a bit more contemporary, landmark cinema like Citizen Kane has them as well, and even more recently, entertainment like Quantico, Psych, and Orange is the New Black makes use of flashbacks, just to name a few. Now, I will be the first to admit that when flashbacks are used unwisely, they can become a crutch or an indulgence for a writer. Flashbacks are often used by novice writers to cram information down the audience's throat in lieu of actual character or plot development that is organically integrated into the story. Another implicit weakness of flashbacks is that they can completely stall the pacing of a narrative because, by definition, a flashback stops you from proceeding in the current events of the story to focus on previous events. But the street runs both ways. Flashbacks have the possibility of being an amazing narrative tool that can aid a writer in creating a very unique story. El Camino is a movie that, thankfully, uses flashbacks excellently, and I suspect it's because writer and director Vince Gilligan has had decent practice with the narrative manipulation of time. Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad, being brainchildren of Vince Gilligan, both make use of flashbacks and flash-forwards. How Vince Gilligan uses flashbacks and flash-forwards has historically been quite restrained though. These jumps in time almost always appear before the events of an episode, are kept brief, and don't provide answers to questions at the center of the narrative. These flash-forwards and flashbacks are simply there to pique our curiosity and give our expectations for the episode a direction to flow in. And that works well, because keeping your use of flashbacks to a minimum helps limit them from being used as a crutch or an indulgence. With El Camino, however, Vince Gilligan decided to be much more exploratory and experimental with his use of flashbacks. In fact, a flashback is the first thing that we see in El Camino. Mike is talking to Jesse about his future and where he wants to go, recommending to Jesse to go to Alaska.
Alaska? Yeah? Yeah, if I were your age, starting fresh. Alaska. It's the last frontier.
This flashback acts in much the same way that a flash-forward would at the beginning of a Breaking Bad episode, subtly prepping the audience for what is to come. However, maybe the most exciting thing about El Camino is how not all of its flashbacks are created equal, and for good reason. Let's take a deeper look at the film to see what I'm talking about. So, excluding credits, the runtime of El Camino is 115 minutes, and within this time frame, there are exactly 10 flashbacks, all of them combining to be about 35 minutes, which means almost exactly a third of the film is flashbacks. What's interesting though isn't necessarily the length of time that they run, but how the flashbacks change depending on where they are located in the narrative. Let's break up the movie into a 3-act structure to get the clearest picture of how the flashbacks change across the narrative. The first act is from the beginning of the movie until about when Jesse leaves Skinny Pete's house. Even though we are already acquainted with them, this is when our characters are being introduced and when the goals and the conflicts of the narrative are being established. As soon as Jesse leaves the house, he is off to face the challenges of the plot, signaling the end of the introduction. This means the first act goes up until about minute 20, which is pretty standard. The second act, containing the midsection and rising action of the film, is everything from around Jesse going on a weekend adventure with Todd to when he leaves the vacuum store. This means that the second act goes up until about minute 80, again pretty standard. With the first 2 acts down, the third becomes pretty easy. The third act begins once Jesse calls his parents and breaks into their house, because everything after is in relation to his final confrontation with the Candy Welders, which you probably recognize as the climax. The third act, of course, runs until the end of the movie at minute 115. So, with our 3 acts set, let's look at how the substance of the flashbacks change according to where they are located in the narrative. As we have established before, El Camino starts off with a flashback. However, this flashback is different from the majority of the others. It's peaceful, almost tranquil, only depicting Jesse talking to Mike for about 2 minutes, like the calm before a storm. The other flashbacks depict Jesse knee-deep in his entrapment, always involved in some kind of struggle. Really, this flashback with Mike acts as a prologue to the film. It's a distinctly separate section that sets the stage and the expectation for what is to come, and then ends to drop us right into the story. The next 2 flashbacks of the first act don't occur until the 8-minute mark and the 10-minute mark, and unlike the 2-minute flashback of the opening, these are very brief, under 5 seconds each. Much like how the introduction works to acquaint us with the characters, these flashbacks, and Jesse's reaction to them, acquaint us with the pain and suffering that Jesse has endured. The first act isn't meant to dive into the meat and potatoes of a character, that comes later, and these brief flashbacks follow that underlying theme. Considering the next set of flashbacks, they occur around minute 20, 31, and 42, placing them in the second act, and for me, these were my favorite of the movie. All 3 of these flashbacks revolve around Jesse's interaction with Todd, and they are so interesting to me because they combine to form a 3-act story all on their own. The first flashback is Todd recruiting Jesse for a weekend adventure. The next flashback is Jesse finding out that Todd murdered a lady and needs to get rid of her body. The last flashback is Todd burying the body and Jesse pulling a gun on him. Just from these 3 flashbacks, we have an introduction, the establishment of a goal and a conflict, a climax, and a resolution. The other interesting part of these 3 flashbacks is that they are all around 7 minutes, combining to be just about as long as a syndicated episode of cable television. They are perfectly segmented in size to be a story all on their own, just inside the larger story of El Camino. And aside from that, they inform us of what Jesse plans to do to solve his current predicament. Instead of halting the progress of the plot, these flashbacks provide information that work to give context to the main storyline and move it forward. The last flashback of the film's second act is a brief glimpse of Todd asking for the gun, mirroring Jesse's immediate conflict. And if you've noticed a theme here, it's that Todd is the focus of all these flashbacks in the midsection. Since much of the second act is Jesse searching an empty apartment, which on its face doesn't have much tension, these flashbacks of Todd add tension and weight to the narrative, while also informing the audience of what Jesse is aiming to accomplish in the present. The next flashback doesn't occur until around minute 90, almost half an hour later, meaning it's in the third act. And while it continues the trend of involving Todd, he is not a central figure like in the other flashbacks. This third act flashback is about 3 minutes long and focuses on developing the character of Neil, whom we are given hints that Jesse knew prior to their run-in at the apartment.
I was wondering when you were going to remember me.
Even though Todd occupied the role of the antagonist up until this point, Neil actually takes over that role in the third act, which makes sense when you think about it. Todd couldn't have remained as the antagonist because Jesse has already overcome Todd in Breaking Bad. El Camino's narrative needed a source of conflict in the present, and Neil became that person. Here is what Vince Gilligan has said about it. It's drama 101. You want Jesse to prevail over some bad guys. If Jesse literally just found the money, went through trials and tribulations, almost got caught by the cops, almost got caught by this person or that, it would have been somewhat interesting, but there wouldn't have been some visceral oomph to it. You want a bad guy for your good guy to prevail against. We couldn't do it all in Flashback because Flashback is in the past. We need someone in the present. What the flashback involving Neil does is develop his character alongside what we see of him in the present to create a detestable antagonist, and it uses Todd to do it. If you pay close attention, you'll notice that Todd is the only person in the scene that advocates for Jesse's well-being.
Kenny, if he breaks his leg, he's not gonna be able to cook.
In fucking HR department? Jesus, Todd, relax.
Neil, on the other hand, doesn't bat an eye at seeing Jesse almost snap his back, or even being in captivity, because there's $50 on the line. In this moment, Neil displays an even more dysfunctional moral compass than Todd, which in a narrative sense would make him an even more terrifying antagonist. Vince Gilligan comments on this too. He says, "What if they hired a welder who was a no questions asked guy, who was such a sociopath in his own right that he would see a guy chained like a dog and he could just not care less? He's more sociopathic than Todd is. Of the two sociopaths, you'd probably want to hang out with Todd, I guess." This specific flashback in the third act builds up Neil as a person the audience should hate going forward. It adds weight and gives credence to Jesse's standoff with him at the climax. And speaking from a functional standpoint, making Neil a maniac who contributed to Jesse's torture would allow Jesse to murder him while keeping moral high ground and likability with the audience, but that's a subject for another video. Moving on to the last two flashbacks, these are especially interesting too, just because they are so different. Occurring at about minute 103 and minute 114, these two flashbacks depicting Jesse and Walt and Jesse with Jane are presented after the climax with the Candy Welders. And by being after the climax, they are then part of the resolution. Both of these flashbacks differ from the rest because they don't show Jesse during his entrapment. They show him in a state of freedom. They mirror Jesse's current position in the narrative of being in Alaska, of finally being free. These flashbacks that occur at the end of the movie are most similar to the flashback that occurred at the beginning of the movie, where Jesse is a free man talking to Mike. And all three of these flashbacks, each existing in a narrative spot outside of the conflict born of Jesse's entrapment, deal with how Jesse will approach his future.
Where'd you go? Fear me?
Doesn't matter, I'm not you.
Seriously, come on. Like if you were my age.
What about you, Jesse? After this, what then?
I've gone where the universe takes me my whole life. It's better to make those decisions for yourself.
Hopefully now you can see my point about how every single one of these flashbacks are constructed differently based upon the section of the narrative that they occur in. And not only that, the contents of these diverse flashbacks all either move Jesse's present plot forward or strengthen the tone and mood of the narrative. And that is how you use flashbacks as a narrative tool and not as a narrative crutch or an indulgence. The flashbacks work in conjunction with the film, not despite it or against it. The entire point of El Camino as a story is that Jesse wants to escape from his current life and the troubles that are intertwined with it. But remnants of his past keep appearing to pose as obstacles against his efforts to find freedom. The flashbacks shove these horrible past events into the present, allowing the audience to be in the same shoes as Jesse. They work on a thematic level to make the trauma of the past inextricable from the present until Jesse, and by extension the audience, reach Alaska to escape them. And to truly make the audience feel the thematic sense of a past that encroaches on the present, the flashbacks of El Camino work in tandem with scenes linked to past events. Just before Jesse confronts the Candy Welders, he allows a beetle onto his hand, much like how he did in Breaking Bad. The spider that Todd keeps in his room is the same one that was once owned by the little boy that Todd shot, a moment that viscerally affected Jesse. And of course, the last scene we see of Jesse in Breaking Bad is him screaming triumphantly for his freedom while driving off in the distance, juxtaposed against his quiet calm at the end of El Camino. And that is why after Jesse gains the money to get to Alaska, the flashbacks go from being depictions of his time in captivity to when he had his freedom, showing us times of peace and open possibilities. Considering the scene with Walt, Aaron Paul has said, "It was beautiful, man. It was so nice to just be in a simpler time in both of their lives. There definitely was some blood on their hands, but not much. And Jane was still around. Heroin had not been introduced into Jesse's life yet. He's just in a happier place. He's in love. It was nice to revisit him in that way." And considering the flashback with Jane, Aaron Paul has said, "It was so sweet and innocent and beautiful. I love that it allows Jane to give Jesse really the best advice he could ever receive. He learned from her, look, you have to create your own destiny and run with it." Even though these flashbacks don't mean much in the moment when you're watching them, they are very important for the narrative at hand because they take us away from the struggle that Jesse has endured and show us a simpler life that he had, akin to a life that he might want again with his newfound future. Vince Gilligan's use of flashbacks always ran in line with this ideal of being in service to the narrative. He recognized that flashbacks need to be used carefully as a tool, not as a crutch for poor plot construction or as an indulgence for his own personal desires. Vince has said, "I remember thinking during the plotting process, it'd be cool if we could see Juan Carlo Esposito. Could we see Gus in a flashback? But I couldn't figure that out either. You just go where the story takes you." As an editor, that last sentence means a lot to me, and is an excellent summation of how I feel flashbacks should be used. They shouldn't be info dumps. They shouldn't be used to cram in details that a writer was too lazy or short-sighted to include in other places. Flashbacks should work hand in hand with the present events of the narrative in order to tell one cohesive story. Jesse Pinkman was haunted by the events of his past. El Camino began with a flashback and continued to merge Jesse's terrible past with his nightmarish present. But at the end of the movie, Jesse was able to hand off the last link to the past he once knew. The movie may have opened with the flashback, but it closes on the present. And it's this careful planning and juxtaposition between past, present, and future that makes Jesse's new lease on life such a great moment of closure. Thank you all for sticking with me and watching through the video. As just one last reminder, if you are interested in supporting the channel, make sure you head on over to the Patreon page through the link in the description. As always, it was a pleasure, and I will talk to you all again soon.